We all stood on the same curb. It did not matter which state the town sat in, or how small the dot on the map was, because on the morning of the 4th of July, our town and every town like it ran the same day, almost to the hour. The trucks rolled out at the same time. A band tuned up in a school parking lot, and by dark the whole population sat on blankets facing the same patch of water. That sameness grew on its own, year after year, until a family could move 500 miles and find the 4th waiting for them, unchanged. This is that day. Walk from first light to the last shell. If you grew up in a small town in the 1960s, you already know every hour of it. Flags. Before breakfast, the fire whistle blew early that morning. One short blast, and for once it meant nothing was wrong. Somebody at the station was testing it ahead of the big day. If you were a kid, that sound reached you in bed. And you knew before your feet touched the floor that this was a different kind of summer morning. Downstairs, the radio was already going. The announcer reading out the day's schedule: parade at 10, games after lunch, fireworks at dusk, the same schedule he had read out last year and the year before that. Main Street was already working. A ladder leaned against the hardware store, and the owner stood on the 3rd rung, clothes pinning red, white, and blue bunting along his awning, half of it still hanging loose. The barber had his own ladder 2 doors down. The town crew came along the curb with a truck bed full of flags and dropped one into each sidewalk bracket. And the flags hung dead still, because the day's heat had not found its wind yet. In some towns, the crews were out at first light, and the newspaper photographers knew it, because the pictures survive. A man alone on an empty street at dawn, setting out flags nobody was awake to see. The park had been cut the evening before, and you could smell the grass from a block away. The bandstand rails were wiped down. Somewhere a pickup was dropping off folding chairs by the dozen. The thing to understand about this day was whose hands built it. The town put the 4th on for itself. That man on the ladder had hung the same bunting last year, and would hang it again next year, and the crew setting flags at dawn would take them down tomorrow night. There was no office anywhere coordinating any of it, and yet towns from one coast to the other woke up that morning and did the very same things in the very same order. By 7 o'clock, a smell started drifting up the street from the direction of the fire station, and that smell was the day's first summons. Everybody knew where to go. Pancakes at the firehouse. The trucks rolled out onto the apron before the town was properly awake. They had been washed the night before, and now they sat in the morning sun with their doors open and their chrome throwing light down the block. Because on the 4th of July, a fire truck had 2 jobs, and the parade was the second one. The first was breakfast. Folding tables ran the length of the bay, end to end, with paper tablecloths taped down at the corners. The griddles had been going since before 7, worked by the same volunteer firemen who would drive those trucks through the middle of town in a few hours. They wore aprons over their station pants and flipped pancakes 4 at a time, a spatula in each hand, arguing about the batter the way men argue about things that do not matter. Syrup came in gallon tins. Coffee came out of urns the size of milk cans. The line went out the door and down the sidewalk by 7:30, and somebody's wife sat at a card table by the entrance taking quarters into a cigar box, while the kids in line got their first sample of the year's adult jokes, most of which sailed over their heads on purpose. The breakfast mattered because of what stood behind it. Every small-town 4th in America ran on the same short list of volunteer outfits. The fire company, the American Legion Post, and the VFW, the JCs, the church auxiliaries, the ladies' guilds. The same dozen names sat on every committee, every year, for decades at a stretch, and the record shows how deep that ran. In Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the Permanent Firemen's Association took over the city's 4th of July parade in 1947 and ran it for years. The parade, the firemen's musters, the band competition, and the fireworks after dark. In Forest Lake, Minnesota, the American Legion post carried the town's whole celebration in a line that reached back past the 1920s. Those towns happened to get written down. Thousands of others ran exactly the same way and never made any record because nobody writes down a thing that ordinary. So when you stood in that pancake line as a kid, paper plate bending under the weight, you were standing inside the town's engine room without knowing it. The man at the griddle coached your ball team. The one pouring coffee sold your father his tires. Once a year, everyone fed everyone, in a garage that smelled of diesel and butter at the same time. And nobody found that combination strange. Down the street, while the plates were still being scraped, the lineup had already begun to form. The whole town, single file. A police car crawled out ahead of everything, roof light turning lazy circles, moving at the speed of a man walking. Behind it came everything the town had. The curb had been claimed since breakfast. Folks set their lawn chairs along the road on the way home from the firehouse. And by 10, the sidewalk stood 2 deep, kids down front on the curbstone itself, fathers behind them with the smallest ones riding on shoulders. The color guard came first behind the police car, flags up, white gloves, rifles at the shoulder, and the chairs emptied as the colors passed, men rising and hats coming off in one long ripple down the street. Then you heard the band before you saw it, drums first, and the drums pulled every kid to the curb's edge. The high school marched in full wool uniforms in July heat, and not one of them got to complain, because out front walked the drum majorette, white boots flashing, baton spun high, holding down the most envied position in the entire school. Some towns fielded a drum and bugle corps besides, sponsored by the Legion or the firemen, older boys and grown men in satin and braid who took their marching seriously enough to win state titles at it, and the applause followed them the whole way down the street. Behind the music came the men. The American Legion post marched in ranks, the VFW behind them, garrison caps square, eyes forward, and plenty of us stood on that curb watching our own fathers go by in pieces of uniform that still fit. Nobody waved at their father right then. You waited until he had passed. The mayor rode in a convertible borrowed off the dealership lot, waving with both hands, the town council walking behind in a loose clump and pretending to enjoy the sun. After that, the parade turned into the town's family album set moving. Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts in troop order. Girl Scouts and Brownies with crepe paper woven through their bicycle spokes. The 4-H Club led a calf on a rope, and the calf had opinions. The Grange came through on a hay wagon dressed up as a float. The church groups followed on flatbeds with ladies in Sunday dresses waving from folding chairs. And here and there came a horse, back when parades still had horses. Where a shrine temple sat within driving distance, the Shriners came too. Grown men in tasseled fezzes, buzzing figure eights and miniature cars scarcely bigger than their own shoes, peeling out of formation and snapping back into it. And no child who ever saw that forgot it. Candy flew from the floats. Kids broke from the curb to scramble for it between the units, and answered the whole procession with cap guns, a popping that ran underneath the drums the entire length of Main Street. The band drew level with the hardware store, and passed beneath the bunting that had gone up on ladders at dawn, brass flashing under the red, white, and blue. And for one long moment, the morning's quiet work and the day's big noise became a single picture. The fire trucks closed it out, ours first, then the engines from the next 2 towns over, because departments rode in one another's parades all summer long, and they came through slow with every siren open. It was the one time all year that sound meant celebration, and the dogs of the town never did make their peace with it. The part you could never see from the curb was the scale. That parade, in nearly that exact order, was rolling down 1,000 main streets at that same hour. Police car, colors, band, veterans, mayor, scouts, floats, fire trucks. A family could move 5 states away, and the next July the same parade would come down a different main street to meet them, unit for unit. as if the whole country had rehearsed it together. No national office wrote that order down anywhere. Towns simply knew it and passed it on and kept it. When the last siren faded, the crowd folded its chairs and walked, all together, in the direction the trucks had gone. The parade emptied into the park, and the park stood ready for what came next. The men at the bandstand folding chairs had waited in rows since morning, and now they filled, and a park holding the entire town went quiet in a way that big a crowd rarely goes. A minister opened it with an invocation, short and plain, hats off, heads down, a town being still together for a minute. The high school band, released from its wool jackets by then, played the national anthem from the bandstand steps, and the crowd sang the way crowds sang then, which is to say everyone, on key or off it. The mayor spoke next and had the good sense to keep it short. Then the Legion commander stepped to the rail. And this was the part nobody rustled through. He read the honor roll, the names of the town's own, slowly, with a pause after each one, and the only sound between the names was the flag rope ticking against the pole. In some towns, a judge or a chosen student read the Declaration of Independence straight through from that same rail, the whole document, in the heat, and people stood for all of it. To understand why nobody fidgeted, you only had to look at who filled those chairs. It was the middle of the 1960s. The men who had fought the Second World War were in their 40s by then, thick through the shoulders. And they were the town. They ran the hardware store, the school board, the fire company, the Legion Hall. The men of Korea were in their 30s, young fathers with kids scrambling around the chair legs. Here and there, in the front row where somebody had made certain of the shade, sat the last few men of the First World War. And when the colors passed, those men rose slowly, and the whole park waited, unhurried, while they did. Those men had carried that flag to places the rest of the town knew only from newsreels, and once a year the town stood still and said so out loud. Small town speeches on the 4th ran to plain sentences and long pauses. The names of local boys, a line about the founders, a line about the fallen, and the words reached faces the speaker had known his whole life, which changed what the words could do. Nobody clapped between the names. Applause waited for the very end, and when it came it stayed brief, the sound of people who had said what they came to say. Then it ended the way it always ended. The band played one last march. The commander folded his paper into his pocket, and the day exhaled. Ties came off. Chairs scattered. Inside of a few minutes, the same lawn where the town had stood in silence turned into a playing field, and the loudest half of the 4th began. Sack races and watermelon car trunks stood open all around the park, and the food came out first. Fried chicken rode in wax paper inside roasting pans. Deviled eggs traveled in a cake pan under a lid that never quite fit, so somebody's thumb held it the whole way over. There was a jug of lemonade sweating through the towel wrapped around it, a metal cooler with the good bottles buried down under the ice, and a tablecloth pinned against the breeze with whatever sat heavy enough to do the job. Families spread out under the same trees they claimed every year, and the claiming was understood all around and honored. Then the games began, and they were the same games in every town in the country, which was the entire beauty of them. Gunny sacks came out of somebody's barn still smelling like the barn. Kids stepped in, gripped the burlap at the waist, and hopped themselves sideways into the grass while mothers hollered lane assignments nobody obeyed. The three-legged race paired up brothers who blamed each other all the way down, and sisters who had practiced in the yard for a week and one going away. The egg toss started politely, two long lines of partners stepping backward one pace at a time, and it ended the only way an egg toss has ever ended, to the loudest cheer of the afternoon. The tug of war had a chalk line in the grass and a rag tied to the middle of the rope. And the fathers took that one seriously. Sleeves rolled, heels dug in. The bank manager on the anchor end losing his hat while the whole town yelled instructions. The watermelon contest ran on a single rule: hands behind your back, and a row of kids went face first into slices bigger than their heads, coming up soaked to the eyebrows, while somebody's grandmother laughed until she had to sit down. In some towns, a greased pole stood off to one side with a prize at the top, and every year a procession of boys took a run at it, and most years the pole won. Prizes were ribbons or $50, and the $50 was better because you could feel the weight of it riding in your pocket for the rest of the day. Nobody kept records. The same families won the same events every single year, and the town made a show of being surprised. By the middle of the afternoon, the heat won every contest at once. The blankets went flat, the grown-ups slowed to a stop under the trees, and the kids had already gone missing, because everybody over the age of 6 knew exactly where kids went on the 4th. Once the games let out. The long wet afternoon, the bicycles left the park in packs, towels over handlebars, a dog or two trailing, the whole pack coasting downhill toward whatever water the town had. Some towns had a lake with a roped-off shallow end, others had a creek with a rope swing, and one deep spot that everybody's father had also jumped into at that same age. In the luckier county seats, it was the municipal pool, all chlorine and hot concrete, and a lifeguard's whistle. Whichever one it was, the kids owned it for the rest of the day. Many of you will remember the truest part of it. No grown-up saw any of it. We swam until our lips turned blue in the middle of July. Nobody signed us in and nobody called us home, because home knew roughly where we were, the way home always knew, and supper would announce itself in its own time. That was simply how an afternoon worked then, and nobody on either end of it thought a single thing about it. Back in the middle of town, meanwhile, something quietly strange went on. Main Street stood empty. The stores had locked up for the holiday. The parade litter had been swept into piles, and the bunting from that morning hung dead still over a street with nobody on it, holding its colors for no one. Waiting on the evening, a town that had stood shoulder to shoulder at noon had poured itself entirely into the water, and the center of everything just waited there in the heat, keeping the day's place. What called everyone back was a smell. Along about 5 o'clock, it came over the fences, from 1 yard, then 10, then all of them, and it meant the same thing on every street in the country. Smoke from every backyard. The match hit the charcoal around 5 o'clock, all over town, more or less at once. A pyramid of briquettes. Half a can of lighter fluid because nobody ever measured. A whoosh. And then the long wait while the coals grayed over, and the men stood around the grill supervising nothing in particular. Hamburger patties came out under foil. Hot dogs split themselves open over the heat. Sweet corn went on in the husk or came boiling out of the big pot inside, and the picnic table had been dragged to the spot on the grass where the shade would arrive by 6. You could stand in any yard in town and smell every other yard doing the identical thing. Supper on the 4th amounted to one town-wide cookout held over 100 separate fires, with the fences in between mostly for leaning on. Dusk had its own equipment. Punks got lit off the grill coals, those slow-burning sticks that kept the mosquitoes honest and lit everything else besides. Sparklers came down the row of kids one at a time from a father who held the box and made the rules. A coffee can of water stood ready for the spent wires, and every kid in America learned to write a name in the air in gold and watch it fade before the last letter finished. What else got lit that evening depended on where you lived. and on which half of the decade it was. In the states that allowed it, the roadside stand had been selling firecrackers all week, black cats by the brick, and early in the decade a boy with pocket money could buy a cherry bomb across the counter the same way he bought a soda. That ended in 1966. The Child Protection Act took the big salutes off the counters for good everywhere. Once the law decided those were far too much firecracker to be selling to anybody's kids. In plenty of other states, the counters had never carried them at all, and the backyard Fourth had always been sparklers or nothing. Two kids the same age, the same summer, one state line apart, remember two entirely different dusks, and each of them remembers his as the way the Fourth was. By full dark, the sparkler box stood empty, and it did not matter in the least, because the lawn chairs were already folded into the trunk. The town was about to drive to the same place. When the sky finally went dark, blankets spread across the grass while there was still plenty of light to pick a spot by, because getting there early was part of it. Families staked out the same square of lakefront or park lawn. They had staked out the year before, and the year before that, and station wagons backed up to the grass with their tailgates down so grandmothers could watch from a cushion. The kids arrived in pajamas. Every parent in town had made the same calculation because everyone knew how the night was going to end, with a child asleep before the car found the driveway. While the light died, the town did its waiting the way towns wait. Transistor radios murmured low. Punks traced slow orange arcs where kids waved them. And the older kids ran the dark edges of the crowd in loose herds, checking on friends they had seen an hour ago. Out past the rope line, down by the water or behind the ball field, flashlights moved, and the flashlights belonged to the same men who had been up before dawn. The volunteer fire department set the show. The man who flipped your pancakes 12 hours earlier now walked the rack of shells with a flashlight held in his teeth. In town after town, that was simply who did it. The firemen or the Legion men, with the shells paid for by the village board or out of the fire company's own pocket. The first one always caught somebody mid-sentence. A thump you felt through the blanket, a rising hiss, and then the crack of light with the whole crowd saying the same round vowel at once. A small-town show in the 1960s came one shell at a time, with long dark pauses in between while the crew reloaded, and the pauses belonged to the show. You lay back and watched the smoke of the last one drift across the stars while you waited on the next, and the frogs kept going somewhere off in the dark. And your father named the colors wrong on purpose to hear you correct him. There was usually a ground display, a spinning wheel or a set-piece flag in fizzing color, nailed to a frame down by the water. Then came the finale. Every remaining shell in a hurry, the crowd's voice sang with it, the water throwing every burst back doubled. And for the length of it, every face in town pointed the same direction, lit, then unlit, then lit again. From the far end of Main Street, if you had been standing there, you would have seen the bunting on the storefronts catch those colors in flashes, red, then gold. The same cloth a man on a ladder had clothes pinned up in the morning cool. And when the last shell faded, the street went black and the bunting hung quiet in it. Done, its whole day carried. Then it was over, and the town made its slow way home. Car doors, low voices, a line of red taillights easing out of the park with nobody honking. The kids who had made it that far asleep got carried over shoulders, and the ones half awake watched the streetlights slide past the car window and understood, the way kids understand things without words, that the best day of the summer had just ended. Porch lights burned on every street coming home. Fathers carried sleepers up the stairs with a practiced grip, and the last sound before sleep was a single late firecracker somewhere across town, some boy spending the end of his stash. The town would wake up tomorrow and take it all down. The flags out of the brackets, the bunting off the awnings, the folding tables back into the fire hall. The same hands that put the day up would put it away. That was the whole arrangement, start to finish. The 4th belonged to the town because the town built it, with griddles and gunny sacks and shells set by hand every single year. And nobody who stood on that grass as a child ever forgot the shape of it. It would be easy from this distance to add up what that day lacked. The shows were small and the speeches plain. A pair of gunny sacks and a crate of eggs covered the games. And the whole budget fit in a cigar box of quarters. The people inside the day were measuring something else entirely. For them, the 4th did a specific piece of work. Once a year, a town got to see all of itself in one place, in one line, on one lawn, and prove with its own hands that it was still a town. The men at the griddle and the men at the shell rack were volunteers to the last man, and they stood there because standing there was what belonging looked like where we came from. The men at the bandstand had their own reasons, carried home from places most of them declined to talk about, and one day a year the whole town stood up alongside them, and that was the conversation. Whether the country was better then, or worse, or anything else, was an argument for other people on other days. The people on that grass were doing something smaller and harder to argue with. They showed up for one another, in daylight and in the dark, every single year. What you make of that is yours. We only lived it.